I'm here with Matthew Finnie, CTO at cloud services provider Interoute. Matthew, you virtualized your data center around 4 or 5 years ago. What sort of impact did you see on your Ethernet switching when you did that?
Not a great deal. Basically, the prime motivation for people virtualizing back then, it kind of is now, is to get better use of the assets. So they had a dedicated server infrastructure, and by virtualizing they were able to maximize the number of workloads per server than if they were to keep it in the dedicated format. So the switching just remained the same as it was in the previous time.
Okay, in that case, did you not see any call to standardize your switching, or did you already run a fairly standardized model?
Interoute's always had standardized switching. So Interoute's model across Amsterdam, Berlin, Geneva, Paris, wherever, is to have standard builds so we can expand quickly. And it also allows for our operations groups to be far more efficient. They're not suddenly looking at the Berlin version or the Amsterdam version. It just makes life simpler.
I see, okay. Now, when you virtualize a data center, you're potentially increasing the volume of data that can be passing in and out. So potentially you can see latency, you can see data bottlenecks. Was that your experience?
Well, on the data bottleneck, Interoute, one thing we don't lack is capacity. So Interoute doesn't have that issue, never has had that issue. I think on the issue of latency, it's a bit of a myth really. I hear this a lot. People say, well, if I move to the cloud or take my data out of my premises and move it into the network, I'm going to have latency issues. No, you're always going to have, if you move things away from you, there's always going to be latency. I think the issue is how you optimize the distribution of, say, an IT asset for your community. You know, we've been using the internet for many years now, and we're quite comfortable with the fact that, you know, someone out there has distributed stuff sufficiently such that I get the right experience I want for whatever I'm using. So I think with IT managers, I think they've got to think what's the best place to put my IT assets, and in the network is far more effective, far cheaper, far more cost effective. And I think the latency issue is kind of sort of, I don't know, never bought it really.
But is there a potential to have data bottlenecks there for a company that perhaps doesn't have the same capacity overflow that you seem to have? Is there a potential to have data bottlenecks, or is that not really the issue?
Well, I think, yeah, if you move all your equipment into some cloud service provider who's got a couple of racks at telehouse and a small switch and 100 meg pipe out into the internet, then yeah, you're going to have problems, right? I think you've got to look at not just if you're moving to, say, a cloud service provider, you've got to look at not just what they've got in terms of their computing offer, but how are they supporting that? What is their infrastructure? How do they get to you? Because, you know, it doesn't matter if you've got the largest factory in the world. If you're coming in via a small country lane, then it's going to be no use. So you've got to combine the two things. Network fundamentally is access to the cloud. So you've got to think, how am I getting to this thing? And am I optimizing my latency? Latency should be the speed of light, right? That's what it should be. If it's anything more than that, then you've got inefficiencies in the network.
I see. Okay, and what about application management? I guess the application management strategy can be impacted by virtualization as well. Has that been your experience?
It was initially, but bear in mind for us, I think we tend to deal largely with infrastructure as a service. So the goal of us is to produce a virtualized instance of a server that appears, to all intents and purposes, can be managed in the same way as its dedicated predecessor. So I think it's vastly improved. There's no doubt about it. The way in which we virtualize and hypervise has become more network aware, which has allowed for more sophisticated levels of management. And I think the other advantage is now, within a purely virtual world, is you can offer far more flexible suites of monitoring and application management to your customers, because you're not putting in physical asset every time you want to do something for a customer. So it makes it a far more agile way and a far more flexible way for application management. So I would argue actually it's improved.
I see, okay. Now, finally, what about the future? So if you want to future-proof your organisation, what would you need to do around Ethernet switching? Is there an advantage now, or is there a potential advantage over the next few years?
I think for us right now, the first thing we've got to do is get trust from our customers. So we've got to get them to trust that we can rack stack, replace their racking, stacking and provisioning service that they do today themselves, and trust that if they give it to someone like an Interoute, someone else, that service, that infrastructure as a service is comparable and is good, because the business case is very compelling. Once that occurs, and once you start to see volume, we're in a much better position to start optimizing the way in which we construct that and deliver it. And I think, invariably we'll look at things like how is, the efficiencies of the Ethernet switching. Bear in mind, when a service provider says efficiency, he really means I want it a bit cheaper, and I want less of switching events to get in the way of how I access data and this sort of thing. For Interoute right now, it's really all about tight integration within our MPLS infrastructure, more so than just the Ethernet switching. Is making it totally MPLS aware. That's really the priority at a sort of technology level.
Fantastic. Matthew, thanks very much.